Hello everybody, my name is Brady and we're back with another React video, and today we're going to be checking out more Crash Course. We're going to be continuing the Crash Course Black American History series. I started this not that long ago and I'm going to try to keep up with it as new episodes come out. Like I said, no promises. I'm very good at falling behind on stuff, but we're going to do our best. It occurred to me that this isn't necessarily a US history or the would-be United States. This is just Black American history, including North and South, Central, the Caribbean, like all over, I would assume. So this is actually going to give me a lot more room to learn about some stuff. I am more familiar with what happened in North America, but there's also so many variants in a state-by-state thing. There are all these sorts of local cultural elements and structural elements that do make the experiences different from place to place, even if they're close. But I'm excited to learn a little bit more about South American history, which I've been getting a little bit more into, having taken a class on Atlantic history recently and written a paper pertaining a little bit more to slave treatment in South America. It's still very new to me, and South America is a big place. There's a lot of definitely differences that would occur from place to place, even though it's all like Spanish Empire. But there's got to be, and the Portuguese. I don't want to leave the Portuguese out. You guys get left out a whole lot, and I'm sorry for that. I almost did it too. Okay, let's just get into the video, and we'll talk about it as it goes on.
Hi, I'm Clint Smith, and this is Crash Course Black American History. Today, we're talking about slavery in the American colonies. In your high school U.S. history class, there's a decent chance you learned about mercantilism, a system in which home countries, or a mother country, in Western Europe, established extensions of themselves in far-off places around the world to produce highly sought-after raw materials.
Yeah, mercantilism is one of the great pieces of the success of empires in the New World, but it's also a huge part of their downfall. The inability for the English and the Spanish, are two big players in this case, to connect with their colonies and really empathize with what's going on that side, really does hold them back, and inevitably is one of the bigger factors, among others, that will contribute to the downfalls of the European empires in the New World. It's kind of crazy, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of discussion about that in here, but it's very much considered while the colonies in the New World will find little benefits from being part of the Spanish or English or Portuguese or whatever empire, French, they'll find little benefits being part of that. It really is, in the end, to benefit the mother country. That is the main goal. Anything else, incidental.
The basic concepts is that exports must always be greater than imports to make a profit. Simple enough. And as is the case with most businesses, one must consider how to maximize their profit. And one of the ways to do that is to minimize production costs. It's basic Econ 101, right? For what it's worth, I never did too well in economics, but even I think I understand this.
Me neither, bro, but
production
yeah.
costs, when those costs rely almost entirely on manual labor. Well, for the British colonists, the answer was just to have workers you didn't pay, which is to say, slavery. In high school, many of our history textbooks provide...
Yeah, we have slavery, and in a lot of the early years, we have indentured servitude, and if you're not familiar with that, that often involved people having their trip to the New World paid for by a sponsor of a kind, somebody who had money, who could afford to ship you across the ocean, and you would pay for that with your labor. Often indentured servitudes have been compared to slaves, but it's not a fair comparison. Indentured servitude was still a system in which the people involved were considered humans with the rights that came with being a human, even though you were not on the top of the rung. You did have kind of a minimal standard that you would be held to. Slaves were not given that right. I read some interesting stuff about some of the early English settlements and how there were questions. Okay, do we give these rights that typically indentured servants have to slaves? Do they have these minimum rights? And they're like, no, of course we don't do that. But that was a question they had early on, and they ended up going the bad way with that.
Provide a broad, though not always deep overview of the role that slavery played in the early American economy. And they don't always make clear how slavery became a legally accepted practice in the first place, and how it contributed to the colony's early economic success.
Dude, I'm gonna have to pause and go through all these little bits in the intro because it's got a lot.
In what is now the state of South Carolina, a Spanish magistrate founded the colony of San Miguel de Guadalupe in 1526 with an unknown number of enslaved Africans. But the colony was a failure, though some historians suggest that the Africans fled to the Wale Indians to set up their own colony. Nearly a century later, 20 to 30 captured Africans, or 20 and odd Negroes, as they were referred to, arrived at Point Comfort, Virginia in 1619. It is the arrival of this group that has come to represent the origins of chattel slavery in the United States, because they were the first to arrive to an English colony, a colony that would, a century and a half later, become the United States. These captives would become instrumental to the success of the Jamestown colony, which succeeded where previous colonies had failed.
So this does seem like it's focusing more on the would-be United States. I thought this was going to be like a broader thing, but it does seem like it's what would become the United States. We're focusing a little bit more on the English side. While it mentions the Spanish, there's plenty you could get into in the South part of the American continents before you get to this part. There's plenty of talking that could be done about that, and it seems like they've skimmed over that because it seems like it's a focus on the English, which episode 2, it's good that I'm finally understanding, hopefully, the actual direction of this series. Because when it says Black American, I don't want to just assume it's United States, though I tend to assume that because you think of American, a lot of people think United States because we have American in our name, but also we kind of have this arrogance to us where we assume everything American is about us, and it's not necessarily, but it often is.
We might imagine the first group of African captives to be foreign to the New World, but they had already had significant contact with Europeans, particularly those from Spain and Portugal. They were part of a group historian Ira Berlin describes as Atlantic Creoles. They were versed in many languages, had some familiarity with Christianity, and sometimes even worked alongside white indentured servants. Europeans did attempt to utilize other sources of labor before turning to enslaved Africans. But the indentured servitude of European immigrants posed issues that prevented colonists from extracting long-term systemic labor from them. For one, European indentured servants could only legally be indentured for a contracted period of time, usually somewhere between 4 and 7 years. When their contracts expired, new indentured laborers had to be found and trained, which resulted in inconsistent levels of production.
Yeah, it still feels crazy long, 4 to 7 years, but these are people who have very high hopes for the New World. They're going to get their servitude done, and then they're going to go off and make a killing. Most of them are not going to go off and make a killing, but they had this feeling of hope in the New World, that there was going to be a whole lot of opportunity for them. One thing that was good about the Americas, there was a little bit more room for upward mobility within the American system. You would never be considered as good as the people back in the mother country, but within British America, you might be able to go from like lower class to like a middle or upper class a little bit easier because there was a lot of room to fill little voids that were in this new expansive place that has just limitless potential at this point. The established structure is not firmly established yet, so you got to find your place within that.
Secondly, well, European indentured servants were white. And Europeans, regardless of their origin, still viewed other Europeans as fully human. Some Europeans were reticent to discipline other Europeans with the same harsh punishment that Africans received. Historical evidence suggests that when mixed groups of Africans and European servants ran away, the Africans within the group would receive the harshest punishment. Settlers also attempted to enslave indigenous people, but this didn't really satisfy their labor needs. And while Europeans
enslaving Indians was eventually frowned upon. Like early on, it was kind of vaguely established. Okay, are these people like white people, or are they more like black people? Like, what are they? And they found this interesting place in between, where they were always looked down upon, but for some reason a lot of people believe they had the capacity to be a little bit more civilized. It's weird, it's arbitrary, but it's a huge part of the missionary work in the Americas. There's a lot of that, not just in North America and South America. There was an incredible amount of missionary work.
did not immediately give up on indigenous labor. Ongoing conflicts with Native Americans made imported Africans a much more desirable source of labor. Slavery, however, had not yet been defined and codified by law. But that wouldn't last. The colonists would soon discover that in order to effectively govern this emerging society, uniform policies would have to be established in order to clearly demarcate the social and political hierarchy. Before any legislation had passed to solidify the parameters of slavery as an institution, there were some allowances that enslaved men and women experienced that would be unfathomable just 20 years down the line. Anthony Johnson, a man who lived in captivity and who eventually worked his way out of bondage, illustrates some of the possibilities for black people in Jamestown, Virginia, before blanketed restrictions were placed on them. While Johnson's story is not representative for all free black people in the region, it is helpful in understanding the process by which slavery evolved into something more concrete.
Yeah, it's interesting. Early on, we had also some black people whose early experiences were closer to that of indentured servants, and some of them found their freedom, were able to make a living, did not necessarily find that upper place in society. They didn't find that place where they were respected by the white people around there, but you have some outliers that are really fascinating stories where their experience seems to go against everything we think should be able to happen during this time. But it's really remarkable learning about this stuff because they don't know what the rules are. There are no rules. So having these outliers, they're not necessarily outliers at this point. We don't know what's common. We don't know what an outlier is. We don't know the rules yet. We're still trying to figure it out. So that's an interesting example he cites there.
Let's go to the thought bubble. Only a year after his arrival in
I
1621,
love thought bubble.
Antonio, who later anglicized his name, experienced one of the many bloody conflicts between indigenous communities and colonists. That year, the Powhatan launched an attack on the Bennett family plantation. Antonio was owned by the Bennetts and was one of the few survivors of the attack. He was later commended for his hard labor and known service. The Bennetts then granted Antonio, who would change his name to Anthony Johnson, permission to farm independently on his own land, even though he was still enslaved. He was also allowed to get married, which he did, to a woman named Mary, and to baptize their children. Eventually,
that's similar to an indentured servants experience. And besides the fact that he is like formally on paper considered a slave, when you would finish your work for whoever paid your passage, a lot of people would get their own land that they could farm on, and they would have something to work with. So I suppose for the time it wasn't the worst deal. This guy, it's an interesting story. I know that I've read about this guy, or maybe somebody who had a similar experience. It sounds like a very familiar story, though.
truly, Johnson and his family became free, though it's unclear exactly how, which reflects the scarcity of documentation that plagues scholars of early African American history. Records show that Johnson's land holdings and property were recognized as legitimate by the local government. And after he lost much of his home in a fire, the county court forgave his taxes. He even defended his ownership of an enslaved African in court, stating that the African, John Casser, was not an indentured servant. Casser alleged that Johnson had violated an indenture contract between the two, but Johnson claimed that he actually purchased Casser as an enslaved worker. Thanks, Thought Bubble.
Isn't that fascinating? Because like a lot of people, just because your heritage dates back to a similar place, they may not have thought of it that way. He's just another slave owner at this point. This guy, yeah, he has a similar skin color to you, but you may not necessarily think about it as like you're enslaving one of your own. No, you're the master. He's the slave, and it didn't really matter what your skin color was. And in a lot of cases, skin color absolutely does matter, but in this case, it wasn't a deterrent from owning slaves. I mean, he did what I guess he thought he had to do to succeed. Doesn't make it right, but damn, it's interesting. It's a psychological marvel. I would love to be able to like get some writings from this guy. I don't know if he wrote or anything, and that's one of the big problems with a lot of early Black American history. We don't have a lot of writing because not everybody was able to write, not everybody was able to read, and that's why often not just in the case of slaves, in the case of a lot of just generally lower and working class people who were not literate, there's a lot missing on them. One thing that's great about the Americas, though, when you're studying it, literacy rates end up getting relatively high over here, which is really cool, and it leaves us with a decent amount of material from ordinary people, which is fantastic.
Sometimes Johnson's story can be used in bad faith to say, hey, look, there were Black slaveholders too. And people do this.
Somebody always does
to
that.
portray slavery as something that both races participated in and were equally culpable in. But those claims ignore the nuances of how the very notion of slavery changed and evolved over time. This point is significant because in the coming years, even the right to speak in court would be stripped from enslaved persons. Johnson himself exemplified the shift between...
I was just thinking that. Yeah, he was allowed to... Johnson himself being allowed to represent himself in court, that's something that Black people aren't going to always have the ability to do. So it shows kind of like the yo-yoing of rights. Sometimes it's like, oh, okay, now you can represent yourself in court. Oh, now you can't. Okay, we have... we have like abolished slavery or whatever, and it seems like everybody's equal. Oh, segregation. Oh, yo-yoing of your rights. You can vote. No, you can't. Okay, that's there's gonna be a lot of that, especially later. The later stuff is what I'm most fascinated with. I don't know if I mentioned this recently, like probably in the previous episode, if I ever did. I've been fascinated with the 60s. I really want to get to the 60s, but that's going to take so long. I don't know how long this series is going to be, but damn it, I want to learn about the 60s.
Race and enslavement as a social status. According to scholar Henry Louis Gates, following Johnson's death, a court ruled that he was, quote, a Negro and by consequence, an alien. Subsequently, his family's land was seized and his descendants faded from the historical record. Between 1640 and 1660, the rules around who could or could not be enslaved became more formalized in the legal system. The John Punch case, one of the most significant during this period, illustrates how courts would begin to differentiate between the two. In 1640, 3 indentured servants, 2 white and 1 black, all fed up with brutal abuse, escaped from Hugh Gwynn's plantation. But once they reached Maryland, they were caught, and they were made to stand trial in court. The Dutchman and the Scot received 30 lashes, an additional year indentured to Gwynn, and 3 additional years of manual labor in service to the colony. But John Punch, the only African, he was sentenced to serve for the rest of his life as a laborer. Following the John Punch case, planters in Virginia enacted measures that would expressly establish the connection between race and social status. These ideas would help shape future generations of slavery in the United States. The new laws only further cemented the subordinate status of Black people. In
That probably
1662,
deserves its own episode.
Virginia General Assembly adopted the rule of partis sequitur ventrum. The rule stated that the mother's race would determine the child's slave or free status.
That is one of the biggest things when it comes to this. Like, normally, when you're passing down anything in English society at this point, the father is like the determining factor. This is like the exception, and it is so incredibly cynical. And it's one of the things that kept a lot of the children of the masters, because the masters would take advantage of their female slaves a lot. That's what kept a lot of them enslaved. It's really uncomfortable. But there's so many downsides when it comes to this rule. It's kind of evil genius stuff, but it's so transparent. It's like they didn't even try to hide how cynical this was.
This policy would ensure that there would be no question of the status of black women's children, even if the father happened to be white. Unfortunately,
With the
quite
master.
intentionally, this set a precedent for how black women's bodies would be used for years to come. What's more, these legal codifications were often justified using religious arguments. Many Christians often equated darkness or blackness with sin. Several biblical passages served as the backbone for the negative and superior attitudes that Europeans had toward Africans. They were described as savages, incapable of governing themselves. And as such, they needed white rule in order for Christ to accept them.
Yeah, this is what I've talked about in the previous episode. It's the paternal view of slavery. Like, you are like the father figure to your slaves, and like, yeah, they perform labor for you, but you're providing them with food or something, and spiritual fulfillment, and really, who's the one making sacrifices here? This is actually the argument that a lot of slave owners ended up making, that like the burden was more on them as this doting father figure to these slaves who don't know better. It's really weird, and it makes you think, like, there's no way these people were this stupid and that they actually believed this stuff. But, you know, when you benefit so much financially from something, you will go pretty far to justify it. You have to be able to live with what you're doing. You got to be able to live with yourself. They found ways to make them the good guys. Even when it seems totally obvious to us that they're the bad guys in this situation, it's insane how much people can dilute themselves.
The essence of this argument was that God intended for white men to rule over black men. Religious doctrine would continue to be used by many over the course of centuries in order to justify the forced labor, subjugation, and violence black people experienced at the hands of their enslavers. Understanding the conditions and development of slave societies in America is crucial to recognizing the racial and economic disparities that have long persisted through U.S. history. Grounding ourselves in the origins of how captured Africans arrived in what would eventually become the United States provides us with an important opportunity to explore how the relationship between race, and servitude, and bondage evolved over time. The institution of slavery developed and changed over the course of decades, becoming increasingly codified in law and more central to the economic infrastructure of certain regions in the young colony. Reviewing the court cases of early Africans in the Americas provides an outlook on the specific rights and liberties denied to Africans compared to the landowning white men who had a voice in the early colonial society. As we dive deeper into Black American history, we will see just how vulnerable to exploitation and manipulation someone can be when the law does not see them as a full person. The implications of who is and is not seen by the law as fully human will have wide-reaching implications as we move forward through American history. There's a long way to go and a lot more to try to make sense of.
Elizabeth
Thanks for watching.
Ooh.
I'll see you next time. Crash Course is
Okay, that could be really interesting. I'm excited to see how. At the time I'm recording this, I believe only the second episode is out, but it's been out for, I think, at least a few days before I'm recording this. So it should probably be pretty soon that the next episode's going to be coming out. So I'm pretty excited about that. I think that'll be really cool. This was a really fun. I hate using the word fun. It's my go-to word when I'm like enjoying learning about something, but fun is a terrible word right now. I should find something a little bit more neutral and less enthusiastic, but also expresses my my excitement to learn, but I don't know. I can't find the word right now. Either way, that was a very well communicated one. I really do enjoy this guy's presentation. I think there's going to be a lot of really cool stuff in this, and I'm learning little stories that I may or may not have known. Like there was an example in there. Like I'm not sure if I heard that story before with that guy who found his freedom. But it sounds familiar, and it sounds, if it's not that guy's specific story, it was somebody in a fairly similar situation. So learning about that stuff is really cool and adds layers to the complexity of the system before it was what we would know it as. So that's very interesting, and it shows us like it didn't have to go the way it did. It really didn't. It could have gone a million different directions, but we got what we got. So thank you guys for watching. I do really want to continue this series, and I think I will. I'll also try to get around to doing the geography ones every once in a while. I know I've fallen pretty far behind on those, but we'll see if I can catch up eventually. I have so many things I want to check out. It's so hard to keep up with everything, but I'll do my best. All right. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you tomorrow with another video. All right.